Alright, here we go. I gotta start leaving this fucking phone in the living room. Oh, alright. Hey, honey.
Hey, honey, have you decided what you want for dinner?
No, I didn't have any plans. What do you want?
I was thinking either pizza or tacos.
Alright. Yeah, that'll work. Get whatever you want. I'm fine with whatever.
Alright, you know what else sounds good?
What's that?
Spilling your guts on the fucking floor.
Classic.
So Scream 3 tells the story of the survivors of our Woodsboro murders in the first two movies, going toe-to-toe once again with a killer who is also stalking the set of Stab 3. Alright guys, now we are at our rough patch in the Scream franchise. And I'll say, before I recently watched this movie last weekend in preparation for this review, I was actually kind of a Scream 3 defender. You know, maybe because I wasn't that invested in the franchise, I always felt like Scream 3 got way too much hate. It's clearly the worst of the franchise, I never argued that. But I always felt like there was more redeeming qualities in the movie than people gave it credit for. I always thought that the intro was pretty good. I always thought that the storyline with Sidney and her mother was interesting and the overall reveals. And I was wrong.
If you find yourself dealing with an unexpected backstory and a preponderance of exposition, then the sequel rules do not apply, because you are not dealing with a sequel. You are dealing with the concluding chapter of a trilogy.
For some reason, when I watched it this past time, it's almost like the blinders were off, all the stars aligned, and I finally saw the movie that everybody had told me that Scream 3 was for the longest time. I will still contend it's not that bad of a movie, but it's definitely a huge, monumental drop-off from the other three movies in this franchise. But in talking about some of those redeeming qualities, let's talk about the good, the positive, the good stuff in Scream 3, and I will say, the thing that's pretty much a positive in all of these movies, Sidney Prescott. Even though this movie has much less Sidney Prescott than the other movies, and we will get into that, Neve Campbell and the character of Sidney Prescott is just as badass, if not more badass, in Scream 3, in the third act especially, than she has been in this entire franchise. As soon as she enters the story, and as soon as she really goes into that third act to take on this killer head-to-head, it is one badass showdown, because she's not taking any shit, she's outsmarting the killer, she's thinking 10 steps ahead, and she's fighting toe-to-toe with this guy like a man. I mean, the fight scene in the third act alone makes you cringe, because you're like, damn, like he is punching the shit out of Neve Campbell and kicking her in the gut and everything, and it's not stopping her whatsoever. So, one more reason why, even though Scream is far from my favorite slasher franchise, I still contend that Sidney Prescott is probably the best final girl of all time.
Oh, shit.
Think again. It's your turn to scream, asshole.
Yeah!
Another character that I enjoyed a lot in this movie, especially when this movie first came out in the 90s, is Patrick Dempsey's character. Now, this was before Patrick Dempsey became somewhat of a household name because of Grey's Anatomy and the other things that he's done since Scream 3. Previous to this, he was kind of a fell off the face of the earth type actor. You know, he was big in the 80s somewhat. He played a nerd in a couple of movies like Can't Buy Me Love, a really obscure movie called Run that I'm a big fan of, but never really saw anything from Patrick Dempsey in years, and all of a sudden he just shows up randomly as this detective in Scream 3, and I will say, aside from Sidney Prescott, he's pretty much the only other character in this movie that is really interesting and really good and glues my attention to the screen. I think that he's damn good as the detective character. He works really well as a red herring, as well as, you know, they don't really fully cook the idea of a love interest somewhat for Sidney Prescott, but there's a little bit of that flavor in there. But I really like what he brought to this movie, and at the time of this release, I thought it was cool to see Patrick Dempsey once again. And my final positive, done already, damn, for Scream 3 is that I do think that, for the most part, the third act is somewhat of a redeeming factor for the other two acts of the movie, because there's a lot of action, there's a lot of reveals, there's a lot of intensity with what's going on. It does feel like anybody could die, which is one of the rules that Randy sets forth as far as this trilogy goes, is that even the main characters can die. The third act feels like it has that intensity to it. I love the fight scenes in it and how intense that gets. I love how this killer feels like the most unstoppable version of Ghostface in any of the previous movies, as well as Scream 4. for some other reasons. It's also kind of a negative, we'll get into that, but overall the third act of this movie is really enjoyable. I think that it's a huge step up from the first two acts, and it does cap the movie off in a good enough place where I'm like, okay, even though you stumbled quite a bit with this one, I will welcome a Scream 4. Actually, you know what? Scratch that. There's one more positive about Scream 3 I need to talk about. The Scream 3 soundtrack is pretty damn good. It's actually music that I grew up with in that era. That's when I started, leaving behind the music I listened to as a child in my youth and started forming my own adulthood versions of my music tastes. Right when I was hitting that transition, that's when all these bands that formed this soundtrack in Scream 3 started coming up. So it's kind of a time portal soundtrack. When I listen to it, when I hear songs from this soundtrack, it makes me think of the movie and it makes me think of that era, and that's always cool. I mean, come on. Classic shit right there. Now for negatives. Every single character in this movie, aside from Sidney Prescott and Patrick Dempsey, even our returning main characters of Dewey and Gale, they're not good. I mean, Dewey is a character that annoyed me in the first movie. In this movie, he's kind of being back to that character somewhat. He's not nearly as interesting as he was in 2, and it really makes me feel like he should have died in 2. Whenever he gets stabbed in that quiet room behind that soundproof glass, whenever he's yelling out to Gale, that would have been a perfect death scene for that character. And the fact that he's back in Scream 3 and he's barely utilized to a very good degree, it feels like that would have been a much better place to leave this character. You get into Gale, her whole shtick about just wanting to chase the story is just getting bored by this time. The whole, will you just fuck already thing going on between her and Dewey gets old by the end of this movie. And the whole thing about her kind of being paired up with her low-rent version of herself from this movie, which really I'm going to talk more in, that also kind of gets tired, where she's carrying around Parker Posey as like this, Gale and B-movie Gale. That just gets annoying. So those two characters bring nothing to this movie, in my opinion, and especially all the new characters. Basically, the actor versions of our Woodsboro characters, they're horrible. They're badly written. They're badly acted. It's almost like they went out of their way to find the worst, like, C-list actors, almost like they were going to play that up for comedy, but they don't play it up for comedy. They play it serious. And it doesn't work. I mean, like I said, Parker Posey. When you get a movie with Parker Posey in it, if it's not Dazed and Confused, that is a gigantic stamp on the front of your movie saying, this shit will not be taken seriously. I'm looking at you, Blade Trinity. And it's just bad in this. You get Dewey, you get low-rent Dewey. You get Gale, you get low-rent Gale. The only one that's kind of somewhat interesting just because of the whole comedic reveal that she fucked Lance Henriksen to get the role is the low-rent version of Sidney Prescott. But everybody else, you don't care about them. They're not entertaining. And when they eventually do get killed, you don't give a flying fuck. And that is rule number one that you should never break in a slasher movie, is make your characters so bland and uninteresting that you don't care who dies, because then you just take the whole element of surprise, the whole element of suspense, and the whole element of terror out of the movie, and you better be a damn good horror comedy if you're not going to do that, and Scream 3 is not that. Next biggest issue in this is the whole focus on Maureen Prescott, Sidney Prescott's mother. Now, I understand that they're trying to go for this, third act reveal of trying to change something that we thought was true from the first movie, but turns out to be something different. Again, playing into the whole rules that Randy sets forth in his little eulogy tape. But you're focusing so much of the plot on a character that we never got to know. We never got to know Maureen Prescott in the first movie. She was dead a year prior to that movie even starting. She's integral to the plot and the killer's motives, but she's not a character that we know anything about, so she's a character that we don't really care about. And when you dive so much of the exposition and the plot reveals and everything surrounding this character and her mysterious past, and we never even got to know them, again, you don't care. I don't care what the hell Maureen Prescott did in her 20s. I don't care what the reveal is going to be regarding what Maureen Prescott was actually doing that we didn't know before. It's not played out very well. It could have been done much better. You can do a little element of that, but don't focus so much of the movie on a character that we don't give a fuck about. Which, piggybacking off of that, another mistake is losing focus on a character that we do care about, namely Sidney Prescott. Sidney Prescott is sprinkled lightly over the first two acts of this movie, and she really doesn't show up to be a main character in Scream 3 until the third act. She gets one little action scene in the second act and then goes and sits in a detective office for a while, then finally comes in to do your showdown with the killer, which is the best part of the movie. Wonder why. But the first 2 acts of this movie, Sidney's nowhere to be found, and you're forced to kind of be focused on Dewey and Gale. And like I said, they're the least interesting portrayals of those characters in the entire franchise. So, huge mistake getting rid of your most interesting and your best card you have in your deck to bring out the worst versions of 2 characters that we are supposed to love but we don't, and a character we've never given a fuck about and gets all the plot exposition. So, again, big mistake as far as the writing goes. And overall, the writing, that's probably the overarching negative with Scream 3, and it's the only one of these movies not to be written by Kevin Williamson, so there is a little bit of correlation there. Kevin Williamson was the big name in Hollywood as far as screenwriting after the first 2 Screams. He had other shit going on. Couldn't commit to Scream 3, so they got other writers to come in, and you can tell. These guys were not invested in Scream the way that Kevin Williamson was. They didn't understand the interworkings of Scream the way that Kevin Williamson did. They tried to make it clever by incorporating the movie within the movie, Stab 3, into the plot, which does kind of enhance that meta nature of the Scream movies, but it's just not as interesting, not as funny, and not as fun as the other movies by a landslide. So, writing overall, that's just the big overarching negative of this movie. And again, we're just subjected to a lot of kills that's just a knife. A knife in the back, a knife in the gut, a knife in the face. It kind of gets a little bit dry by the time you get to this movie, and especially the sequels to come, because it's really the same shit. It's just stabs to the stomach, stabs to the back. I will say too, the intro to this one pales in comparison to the other 3. You know, the first Scream has probably, arguably, the best opening to any horror movie ever. I mean, it's within the conversation of best openings to a movie ever, easily. I'll argue that with anyone. But you get to Scream 2, and it's a pretty good intro as well. There's just some logic issues that I have with it. You can check that out in my other review. But you get to Scream 3, and really the only clever thing that they try to bring to this is that now the Ghostface killer has a device that can mimic other people's voices.
It was a simple game, Cotton. You should have told me where Sidney was. Now, you lose.
So you can trick people into thinking that, you know, Gale Weathers is calling you or Sidney Prescott is calling you when it's really Ghostface, which is an interesting small element to bring to the killer of Ghostface, but it's not creative or cool enough to merit this big opening to a Scream movie, which is supposed to be kind of the tentpole scene of the movie so far, and really what it all ends up being is just a setup to kill Cotton Weary. And you know, that does raise the stakes a little bit whenever you see the movie and one of the more integral characters to the plot gets killed right away, but again, Scream proved that with the first movie with killing Drew Barrymore right away. So it's an intro that just does not come close to being as awesome, as clever, or as shocking as any of the other intros in the franchise. And that does go along with the reveal of the Ghostface killer as well. When you get to the first movie, the reveal is very cool. It's, you know, kind of plays on the red herrings, and it's very entertaining from there on out. I think the second movie is even better with its reveals because it's a lot better keeping the secret of the killers, because I always kind of figured the killers of the first movie. When you get to Scream 3, the red herring thing doesn't quite work because you don't care about any of the characters. So any of the characters that you think might be the character, you really don't give a shit who the killer ends up being, because the only other character in the movie that is interesting is Patrick Dempsey, and it feels like it's too on the nose of a red herring for it to be Patrick Dempsey, so I kind of just discounted him completely. And then you get into the whole reveal with it being Roman, the movie director, and then he turns out to be Sidney Prescott's brother.
Roman Bridger, director. And brother.
And he set up the events of the first movie. I don't like it when a sequel does way too much and tries to alter events of a much better movie, and this tries to do that. Whenever you start kind of twisting the details and the motives and the storyline of Billy Loomis and Stu in the first movie, and you try to make it to where they were puppets on a string of this other smarter guy, but that smarter guy is not nearly as effective as a character or nearly as interesting as a character as those other two, again, it doesn't quite work. And it doesn't really make him that much more intimidating of a Ghostface killer either, just because he's the only one that was smart enough to wear a bulletproof vest, which is something that, it's one of those things that they do that's a little bit weird in Scream 3, where they introduce all these rules, you know, Randy's rules about the trilogy, and he's talking about there's a superhuman killer, the bullets aren't going to kill him, this isn't going to kill him, basically you got to cryogenically freeze his head. And it's all true, and it's poking fun at some of the tropes of trilogies and the third movies in those trilogies. But at the same time, if you're going to poke fun at them and if you're going to draw attention to how silly that is, don't make that a cliche within your own movie. Don't make it a cliche that every single time that Ghostface gets shot, he gets back up, and nobody is smart enough, even the fucking cop character that is integral to this entire franchise, Dewey, is not smart enough to figure out that his bullets aren't doing shit when he shoots an entire clip into him and he's still coming.
He wasn't superhuman, Dewey. He wasn't superhuman at all. Dewey! What? Head! Shoot him in the head!
That kind of stuff, it gets a little bit too silly. It should have been toned way the hell down, and again, it just goes back to writing. If you had a more capable writer for this franchise like Kevin Williamson was, those elements would have been utilized a lot better. So overall, guys, I gotta say, I'm kind of disappointed in how much Scream 3 has devalued itself over time. It used to be a sequel that I actually thought was much better than people gave it credit for. Nowadays, I really don't have much defenses for it other than saying it's not as bad as a final chapter as most of the other, you know, killer franchises. It's definitely not a Freddy's Dead or a Halloween Resurrection or Jason Goes to a gigantic fucking boat ride all the way to Manhattan for 4 hours. It's nothing like those movies, but it is definitely the weakest of the Scream franchise. And for a franchise that, if you take Scream 3 out, is pretty fucking great all the way through, it's a very disappointing sequel that I probably will not revisit unless I'm doing a marathon or I'm doing a video on it, because it's such a huge high going for Scream 1 and Scream 2 to take a huge dip for Scream 3 to come back up to Scream 4. It just feels like a step that I don't need to take anymore. So there you have it. Scream 3, nah. So if you're a fan of the franchise, obviously you should check this one out just to keep yourself up with the story, and because there is some entertainment value there in the Scream franchise, no matter how bad the movie is. But this is a gigantic dip in quality, and it's the only movie in this franchise that I do not recommend that you own whatsoever. So save your money and your time, and if you want to check this out, then check it out on Netflix. So what do you guys think of Scream 3? Are you a fan of this chapter? Are you a fan of the entire franchise? Or do you think that Scream 3 is the most god-awful piece of trash to ever come out? Because I've heard people say that, as ridiculous as that sounds. Put what side of the camp you are on Scream 3 down in the comment section below, guys. And please, as always, like and share this video. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber. If you guys want to check out some of my social media links, check down below for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, my Spreadshirt store for Cody Leach t-shirts and other merchandise, and my Patreon page, which is a great way to give back to this channel, help it grow, and get cool exclusive content for your eyes only, such as the ability to suggest videos for me to do, like a movie review or a top 5 or a ranking, and the Blu-ray digital copy codes that I give away to my patrons almost every single week as I go out and buy Blu-rays. Those are all patron exclusive privileges, guys, so check that out. And if you want to check out some more of my videos, including the rest of this Scream franchise review, you can check out that by clicking right over here.